This video looks at working with elastic to create gathers mid-fabric. First of all using elastic on its own and then working with elasticated casings and channels. This is elastic used on its own, and this is a fabric casing sewn onto the back of the fabric through which the elastic is threaded. And this is elastic inserted into a channel that is created between two layers of fabric. And this is a channel created using a twin needle. Here, and I'm working with a 3mm quite narrow elastic. I'm using a contrasting colour so that it's easier to see how much gathering or ruching can we get. So if the fabric is this wide and I choose to use half the amount of elastic, so that would mean sewing half the width of the fabric stretched onto the garment, that should, by the time it's stitched on, actually scrunch the fabric back down to its original size. But it would be interesting to know, if I pull the elastic to its full stretchability, how small could the piece of elastic go? And that's roughly 1/3. So roughly 1/3, depending on the elastic, is about the tightest gather we could get. So in this case, I'm going to take half the width, fold it in half, and that's the size of elastic I'm going to gather on. As a guide to lay the elastic down onto, I'm just going to draw a line onto the back of the fabric using this soluble marker, and then I can align the elastic up with that. I've just placed a pin at the beginning, and I've placed a pin also here down at the very end, and just so that I have a guide for the center, I've placed a pin there in the very center as well, and stitch well at the beginning, to and fro. So I'm now going to work between where I've stitched the elastic down to the next pin. So stretching that elastic out, down as far as the next pin, it's aligning well with the blue line that I have in underneath. You can see there's quite a nice elasticated effect coming out the back of the machine there. Okay, so I've just about hit the pin, so I'm going to take it out. So again, to stretch the remaining elastic out taut, so that we're now going to sew right down to the next pin. So this is the end result. Now obviously I've got the wrong colour thread here, but this is quite a nice elasticated effect, and because this is quite sturdy elastic on the other side, this would really withstand quite a bit of pull or wear and tear or machining. In the second demonstration, I'm going to sew a casing onto the fabric in order to thread the elastic through. So just out of ease, I'm going to work with this piece of bias binding, and it just happens to be narrow and it'll provide good contrast. You'll be able to see it. And I'm just going to stitch it very close to the edge. So that is the first side of the casing sewn down, this bias binding strip. I'm aligning the groove in the center of the foot here 1 millimeter in from the edge of the fabric as a guide. This time round, because I have a wider casing to work with, I'm going to thread a thicker elastic through the center. So long as it fits on in between the stitching, it will be perfect. What I'm going to do is I'm going to thread it and then pull it to see what amount of gathering I would like. So I'm going to work with a bodkin. This is one type of bodkin, but it's actually too big to fit through the casing that I've created. So the other type of bodkin that I have is really like a large sewing needle. So if I thread the elastic through the back of the needle, sometimes people like to use a safety pin, but again it would have to be a very small safety pin, and sometimes a hair clip works. So I've now got the elastic safely through. I can remove the bodkin. So I'll pull back some of the excess elastic but I'll leave a little bit hanging out of here until I have safely sewn this off. So I'm going to put a pin in just to hold it. Okay, and once I've sewn it off, it'll be a little bit safer. I can now gather or elasticate this as much as I deem appropriate by pulling the elastic on this end and dividing the gathers evenly. So I think that that looks like quite a nice length. I actually like the contrast trim here, but if this had been made of the same fabric, so maybe making a piece of binding in a matching fabric, could work quite well, and this still stretches out to the original width of the fabric. So to finish off the two ends, and if I hand do 1 or 2 stitches here before I take the pin out, I don't want the elastic to disappear back in here. Okay, so that should be enough to hold it. I can take the pin out and then stitch to and fro. Should hold this elastic very securely, and with this being the seam allowance now, this is well inside. If I was using a 1.5 seam allowance, this finish is well inside that 1.5. Repeat the same on the other side of the elastic casing. So this is now the finished elasticated section. Now another technique of elasticating a piece of fabric is to work with 2 layers of fabric. But if you've got 2 layers and you design the garment as having 2 layers, then we don't need to sew on the channels. By sewing 2 rows of stitching, we're then making a channel through which the elastic can be inserted. So what I'm going to do is draw a guideline, and I'm going to draw the guideline here using a soluble blue marker. Pin along the line to hold the 2 layers together. Then I am working with the 2 layers of fabric here, and I'm going to make the channel within the 2 layers. So along the guideline. So the elastic that I'm working with is 6 millimeters in width. So just to give me a little bit of ease, I'm going to work with the channel maybe about 0.8 to 1 centimeter wide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to align the black line here with the first line on the machine, which gives me about 2 millimeters to the left hand side of the foot. And then following this distance for the length of the stitched channel. I'm going to work with the same bodkin as I did the last time round. So threading the elastic, which is 6 millimeters, and if I put a decent enough fold on it, I think it should happily enough go through here. And I'm going to thread the elastic down through the center here. Okay, so now that I safely have this section out at the end, I can pull it back. Just need to take care not to pull it the whole way out. Maybe hold on to the end of it there. Okay, so I'm going to pin this. So I'm going to sew the elastic in on this end, and then I can pull to get whatever amount of gather it is that I'm hoping for in this garment. And stitching to and fro. Make sure when you're sewing the elastic off here that you're sewing within the seam allowance, so that when you eventually sew this into a garment, that the stitching that you do here will not be visible on the finished garment. Adjust the elastic to the required length. Sew off the end the same as for the first side. But what's really nice is that you've got a really nice finish on both sides. I've got 2 layers of fabric here, and I've got the machine set up on a twin needle. So the twin needle here is 4 millimeters wide, so it will in fact stitch a channel of 4 millimeters in width. This is the resulting 4 millimeter channel. Because I've worked with the twin needle, I've ended up with this zigzag effect on the back because there's only one bobbin thread. So the elastic I have is 3 millimeter, so it's going to be quite a tight fit. And I have the same bodkin needle as the last time, so just doubling it over quite a bit. I don't want to lose this elastic halfway through. Okay, so starting to thread then through the gap at the end. Okay, so this is quite tight at the very beginning here, but the needle has actually gone in. So it's created this very, very narrow little elasticated finish. So I would say it is really quite nice. I mean, it was quite difficult to get it through, but quite a good result. So what I'm going to do is sew off both ends and we can take a closer look. Make sure with the elastic as narrow as this that you've got a good short stitching length. I have the machine set on 2.5 out of a stitch length of 5 options. So this was the first technique where we sewed the elastic on at the back, and it's not a great finish because the elastic is on view, but I also think that the elastication here is very zigzaggy looking and it doesn't sit particularly straight. So the seam tends to go up and down like this because there's only one row of stitching in this one. So the second one then is where we sewed a channel onto the back or the front of the fabric, whichever you prefer, and the elastic was inserted into that channel. Now what's really nice with the channel is the fabric tends to sit a little bit straighter and the gathers have this really nice up and down, up and down, up and down quality. You can really see that the gathers are in this section here, and again if we look at it on the other side, it has that very nice almost like parallel gathers in this area. And the third one then, the assumption here is that the fabric is probably a little bit lighter than this fabric, but what's really nice is that you've got a really nice finish on both sides. So both sides are identical. So this could be a garment where you have an outside and a lining and you're deciding to insert an elastic, or it could be a finish maybe in a dress where you're elasticating the waist, or it would be particularly nice in a sleeve or with anything that has 2 layers of fabric in. Just in comparison, this is the extremely fine little one with the 3mm elastic.